The morning my mother-in-law smiled and told me I was no longer needed, I had just finished paying the mortgage on the house she was standing in. She held her coffee mug with both hands, the one I bought her last Christmas, and looked at me the way you look at a house guest who has overstayed their welcome. Not with cruelty, almost with pity. That was the part that stayed with me the longest. Not the words. The pity. My name is Sarah. I'm 31 years old, and for 26 months I had been quietly paying $5,200 every single month to keep a roof over a family that had slowly stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a resource. It began the way most quiet disasters begin. Gradually, then all at once. When my husband Daniel and I got married 3 years ago, we had a plan. A real one. We were going to save for 2 years, build up a cushion, then buy our own place. His mother, Carol, offered us the spare rooms in her house in the meantime. Just temporarily, she said. Just until you get on your feet. She said it warmly. She meant it warmly. I believed her because I had no reason not to. Then Daniel's company downsized 6 months in. He was laid off on a Tuesday and spent the next 3 weeks on the couch convinced it would resolve itself. I didn't panic. I loved him. I told myself we bend, we don't break. I picked up an extra consulting contract. I told him to take his time. He took a very long time. The bills didn't wait. Carol's mortgage had always been tight. I knew that. She worked part-time at a dental office, and her income covered her basics, but not much else. When Daniel stopped contributing his share to the household, something had to fill that gap. I filled it. First with utilities, then groceries. Then a plumbing issue in the second bathroom that turned into a full renovation because the pipes were older than I'd realized. Then the mortgage itself, because Carol pulled me aside one evening in the kitchen and said, in a very quiet voice, that she was 3 weeks away from a late notice. I wrote the check. I told myself it was temporary. What I didn't understand then was that temporary, in that house, had no expiration date. 18 months in, Daniel found contract work. Freelance projects here and there, inconsistent, but income nonetheless. I assumed we'd start splitting things again. We didn't. By then the transfer system had been established. My account to the household account every first of the month. Nobody asked me to change it. Nobody asked me much of anything, actually. I was infrastructure by then. You don't negotiate with infrastructure. You just expect it to function. I paid for the kitchen backsplash Carol had been wanting for years. I paid for the new water heater. I paid for the landscaping she bragged about to the neighbors every spring. I paid for the streaming services, the security monitoring, the pest control, the bi-weekly cleaning service. I paid for the dining table they ate dinner at every night. I paid for the sectional in the living room where my brother-in-law Ryan sprawled on weekends watching football and making jokes about how lucky Daniel was to have married so well. Nobody said thank you. Not because they were ungrateful exactly. More because they had forgotten there was anything to be grateful for. The money had become invisible, and I had become invisible with it. Ryan was 3 years younger than Daniel, louder, more comfortable taking up space. His wife Brittany was the kind of woman who redecorated rooms in her head before she even walked into them. They lived 40 minutes away in an apartment they'd been complaining about for 2 years. Too small, Brittany would say at Sunday dinners. No yard. The neighbors are terrible. I always nodded. I always smiled. I never said what I was thinking, which was that having somewhere to go home to afterward wasn't something I took for granted anymore. The night everything changed, Carol called a family dinner. Not unusual. She cooked pot roast, opened a bottle of wine, set the table that I'd paid $380 for. Ryan and Brittany arrived with a bottle of sparkling cider instead of their usual red. I noticed that first. Brittany was glowing in the specific way that makes the announcement unnecessary. They were expecting. Due in 7 months, the table erupted. Hugs and tears and Carol pressing her palms together like a prayer answered. I was happy for them. Genuinely. I hugged Brittany and meant it. Then Carol sat back down and folded her hands on the table and looked at me with that expression. The one I didn't yet have a name for. She said Ryan and Brittany would need more space. She said the master bedroom, the one Daniel and I shared, had its own bathroom and more closet space, and a baby needed room to grow. She said she hoped I understood. She said it might be a good opportunity for Daniel and me to explore our own options. She said it so gently, so reasonably, that for a moment I thought I had misheard her. I looked at Daniel. He was looking at his plate. That was the moment. Not the words. That small, deliberate absence of eye contact from the man who had promised to stand beside me. I said I understood. I said I'd think about it. I smiled across the table at Brittany, who smiled back with the particular warmth of someone who has just won something and is gracious enough not to celebrate too openly. Ryan poured himself more wine. Daniel finally looked up and gave me a half-smile that was supposed to communicate solidarity and communicated nothing. I excused myself to use the restroom. I stood at the sink with the water running and looked at my own face in the mirror above the vanity I had paid to have retiled the previous spring. The grout was still bright white. I had picked the shade myself. Something shifted in me that evening. Not breaking. Something cleaner than that, a door closing quietly on its own weight. I went back to the table. I ate pot roast. I helped clear the dishes. I said goodnight to everyone with warmth. I no longer felt and meant every word of none of it. That night I lay in the dark beside Daniel and listened to him fall asleep in under 4 minutes, the way he always did, easy and unbothered, while I stared at the ceiling and did arithmetic in my head that I had been too loyal to do before. 26 months. $5,200. $135,000, roughly. Not counting the renovations. Not counting the appliances. Not counting the table, the couch, the water heater, the landscaping, the cleaning service. The security system that had been sending alerts to my phone this whole time because I was the one who'd set it up. I got up at 5:30 the next morning, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and my accountant's number pulled up on my phone. I waited until 6 to call him. He picked up on the second ring. I told him I needed a full accounting of every transfer I had made to this household for the past 2.5 years. I needed it organized, dated, and totaled. I needed it by end of day. Then I called a moving company. Full packing service, I said. Today, if possible. They had an opening at noon. Then I called my attorney. I had used her once before, for a contract dispute with a client, and she had impressed me. I told her the situation calmly, without embellishment. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me one question that changed everything. She asked whose name was on the mortgage. I told her I had been paying it directly for 14 months. She asked again, whose name? I thought about it. Remembered the conversation Carol had with Daniel, the paperwork she'd mentioned, the way Daniel had come to me and said his mother's credit wasn't strong enough to refinance a loan. And could we add my name to help her qualify for a better rate? And it would just be paperwork. It wouldn't mean anything. I told my attorney I believed my name might be on the mortgage documents as a co-borrower. Another silence. Longer this time. She told me not to move anything yet. She told me to come to her office at 2 o'clock and to bring every financial record I had. I said I would be there. I closed my laptop. Daniel was still asleep. The house was quiet. I looked around the kitchen. The backsplash I'd chosen from 3 samples spread across the counter one Saturday afternoon. The pendant lights above the island. The small herb garden on the windowsill that I tended every Sunday morning. The coffee maker that I had bought because Carol's old one had died and she'd mentioned it twice. I felt very calm. By 10 in the morning, Daniel had come downstairs, poured himself coffee, and told me, with the careful tone of someone delivering news they've been coached on, that his mother's idea made a lot of sense and that maybe this was actually the push we needed to find our own place. He said it like he was doing me a favor. Like the idea had just occurred to him organically and was not the product of a conversation I had not been included in. I said that sounded reasonable. He looked relieved. He kissed me on the cheek and went back upstairs to shower, and I stood in the kitchen and thought about 26 months of making myself smaller so everyone around me could feel bigger. The movers arrived at noon. I started in our bedroom. Clothes first. Then the things I had brought into this house that had never stopped being mine, even when they'd been absorbed into the scenery. My grandmother's lamp. The weighted blanket I'd bought during a week I didn't want to think about. The framed print above the dresser. The small bookshelf I'd assembled by myself one Sunday because Daniel said he'd do it and didn't. Carol was at work. That was fine. I wasn't doing this for an audience. By 2 o'clock, when I left for my attorney's office, the moving truck was halfway full and 2 men were carefully wrapping the sectional I had paid $1,100 for in moving blankets. I had left the beds. I had left the dishes. Mostly. I had left things that were genuinely the family's, things that predated me. I had not left anything with a receipt in my name. My attorney spread the documents across her conference table and was quiet for a long time. The mortgage refinance from 14 months ago listed me as a co-borrower with full legal standing. I had signed the documents. I had not fully read them, which was my error, but the legal effect was the same regardless. My name was on the note. My credit had secured the rate. My payments had covered every single month since. She explained my options slowly and clearly, the way good attorneys do when they already know what they're going to recommend. I told her to proceed. I got back to the house at 4:30. Daniel's car was in the driveway, so was Ryan's. I walked in through the front door carrying my attorney's folder and found them both standing in the living room staring at the space where the sectional used to be. The walls looked different without furniture. Larger. More honest somehow. Daniel turned around and his face cycled through several expressions before it landed on anger, which told me everything I needed to know about where his priorities had organized themselves. "What did you do?" he said. "I moved out," I said. "Like I was asked to." He gestured at the room. "You can't just take everything." I crossed to him and held out my phone with the banking app open. Not angry. Not shaking. Just factual, the way my accountant had organized the numbers. 5 years of being a human calculator had at least taught me that. He looked at the screen for a long time. He looked at his brother. Ryan said nothing, which was the first sensible thing Ryan had done in the 3 years I had known him. I told Daniel I was staying at a hotel and that he should speak with a family attorney before contacting me again. I gave him my lawyer's card. I told him to have a good evening. I meant that part, in the specific way you mean things you are completely finished caring about. I was almost to the door when Carol came in. She saw the empty room first, then the movers, who were coming through the hallway with the dining table disassembled and wrapped. Then me. Her face did something complicated. She said my name once. Just once. And in that syllable, I heard the beginning of about 12 different conversations she was preparing to have with me, some of them rational and some of them not. I handed her an envelope instead. Inside was a single page. My accountant summary. Total contributions, itemized. Every transfer, every direct payment, every renovation invoice. The number at the bottom had 6 figures. It was not a demand letter. My attorney's letter was coming separately, by certified mail, the following morning. This was simply information. This was simply what had been true all along. Now visible. Carol read it standing in her hallway with her coat still on. She looked up at me, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw something in her expression I had never seen before. Not gratitude, not quite, but the beginning of understanding, which sometimes looks the same. I said, I hoped the house would serve the family well. I said it without bitterness. I walked out. The hotel room was quiet in the particular way that expensive quiet is. I ordered room service. I ate slowly while reviewing documents on my laptop. I slept for 9 hours straight, something I had not done since before I moved into that house, and woke up feeling like a surface that had been cleaned. The calls started by noon the next day. Daniel called 4 times before noon. I let them go to voicemail. His messages moved through the same stages in the same order, confusion first, then frustration, then something softer that I did not let myself interpret too generously. Ryan sent a text that said this is really unnecessary, which I found interesting because it demonstrated that he had not yet looked at the number at the bottom of that page. Carol left a voicemail on the 3rd day. Her voice was different from any version of it I had heard before. Quieter. She said she hadn't understood the full picture. She said she hoped we could sit down. She said the word family 3 times in 90 seconds. Which told me the full picture had now arrived via certified mail and she was recalibrating. I did not call her back that day. My attorney called me instead. She had made contact with Carol's representative, a local attorney Carol had apparently retained quickly, which suggested that the certified letter had landed exactly as intended. There was interest in resolving this outside of court. There was acknowledgement of my co-borrower status. There was a number being floated for a buyout of my legal interest in the property. I told her to counter. Meanwhile, the house was unraveling in the background in ways I had not orchestrated and did not need to. The security monitoring had been on my account. When I canceled it, I called to give them a full week's notice and let them know the account was closing, which was more courtesy than anyone had extended me. The streaming subscriptions I'd been paying disconnected on their own billing cycle. The cleaning service I'd scheduled bi-weekly had my card on file. When that card was no longer authorized, they sent a polite email and then simply stopped coming. Daniel texted me to say the house felt different. I imagined it did. I was not trying to punish anyone. I want to be precise about this. I was simply not subsidizing a situation I had been removed from. There is a difference between cruelty and cessation. I had stopped the thing. The thing had consequences. Those consequences belonged to the people who had made the calculation that I was optional. By the end of the second week, Daniel drove to my hotel. He sat across from me in the lobby, and he looked like a man who had spent 2 weeks thinking very hard about something he had spent 3 years not thinking about at all. He had lost the easy quality he usually carried. Something in him had become temporarily weight-bearing, which was uncomfortable for him, and, I realized with some surprise, no longer something I felt obligated to relieve. He said he was sorry. I told him I appreciated that. He said he hadn't realized how much I'd been carrying. I told him that was accurate. He said he didn't know what to do now. I told him that was something he would need to figure out and that I hoped he would, but that I could not be the person who figured it out for him. He asked if we were done. I had thought about how to answer that question for 2 weeks, not with anger, with honesty. I told him that the version of us that existed in that house was done. That a version of us that was different, genuinely different, was something I was not yet able to rule out. But that different required him to make choices I had never seen him make, and that I was not able to wait at a hotel indefinitely on the possibility that he might. He nodded slowly. He said that was fair. It was fair. That was the thing. I had not stopped being fair. I had simply stopped being free. My attorney called me 6 days later with a number that made me sit down. The legal resolution accounted for my co-borrower status, my documented contributions, and the equity position I held in a property whose value had increased during the period of my involvement. When you put those 3 things together and factor in the renovation work that had been completed under my financial direction, the number was not small. Carol and Daniel could not buy out my share without selling the house. They could not afford to refuse. The family attorney had apparently made this very clear to them in terms they could not dispute because the paperwork was clean and the records were thorough, and the transfers had my name on every single one. The house sold 8 weeks later. Quietly. Without announcements, without the Sunday dinners that used to fill it, the landscaping looked good in the listing photos. The kitchen backsplash caught the light beautifully. Carol moved into a smaller rental closer to Ryan and Brittany. Ryan and Brittany found a 2-bedroom apartment, which was not the house they had imagined themselves starting a family in, but was the house the math allowed for. Daniel found a studio 30 minutes from where we had lived and texted me a photo of it on move-in day. It looked clean and manageable. I told him I was glad. The dissolution of our marriage was finalized 4 months after I walked out with the movers. No drama. No courtroom. Our attorneys did most of the talking. We signed things, and then we were 2 separate people with separate addresses and separate bank accounts that had, for a long time, been less separate than one of us had understood. I signed a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows and a kitchen I chose entirely myself. Every object in it I selected. Every piece of furniture I bought because I wanted it, not because someone needed something and I happened to have a credit card. The coffee maker is excessive for one person, and I don't care. I pay my rent every month. I pay my utilities. I pay for the cleaning service I hire every 2 weeks, the one I chose. For my own space. I do all of it without explaining myself to anyone, and without waiting for acknowledgement that doesn't come. Some people have asked me if I regret how it ended. If I feel guilty about the house being sold, about Carol having to start over, about Ryan and Brittany and the baby who didn't choose any of this. I think about it honestly, the way you have to if you're going to be someone you respect. I didn't take anything that was not mine. I stopped paying for things I'd been asked to vacate. I did not manufacture consequences. I simply stopped absorbing them on behalf of people who had stopped noticing I was doing so. The cruelty, if there was any, belonged to the moment Carol sat at a table I paid for, drank coffee from a machine I bought, and told me my presence was a problem she needed solved. I absorbed it the way I always had. Quietly. Efficiently. And then I stopped absorbing. What surprised me most in the months after was not the freedom, though the freedom was real and clean, and I won't pretend otherwise. What surprised me was how quickly the grief moved through me once I stopped pretending it wasn't there. I had loved Daniel, genuinely. In the beginning, I had loved the version of our life I had believed we were building. Letting go of that hurt in a sharp, specific way that I hadn't let myself feel when I was busy managing everyone else's comfort. I let myself feel it in the apartment with the good windows. I cried a couple of times in a matter-of-fact way. The way you cry when something is genuinely over and you know it and there is nothing left to bargain with. And then I was done crying. And then I got up and made coffee and went to work. I got a promotion 4 months after I moved out. Not because I worked more hours, which I had always done, but because I stopped spending mental energy on invisible labor that had nothing to do with my career. Cleared space has a way of filling itself with things that serve you better than what you removed. A colleague asked me once what my secret was. She meant it as a compliment about my output, my focus, the way I'd streamlined my workload. I thought about Carol's table, about 26 months of transfers, about a stack of receipts in a folder my attorney called thorough. I told her I'd gotten very clear about what I was actually paying for. She laughed and said she needed to figure that out herself someday. I told her it was worth it. I meant that entirely. There's something they don't tell you about being the invisible engine of someone else's life. They don't tell you that the moment you stop, the engine doesn't get replaced. They don't tell you that the people who never saw it running are the least equipped to understand why everything has suddenly stalled. They will look at the silence where the machinery used to be and call it your fault. They will say you are tearing something apart. They will not say, because they cannot say, what they mean, which is, please come back and disappear again because we do not know how to function without you, and we never learned because you made it so easy not to. I was not tearing anything apart. The thing was already hollow. I had just been filling it. When I stopped, they finally had to see the shape of what had always been there. And me. I walked out through the front door on an ordinary Thursday afternoon into ordinary sunlight, and I drove to a hotel, and I ordered dinner, and I opened my laptop. And I began, quietly and without ceremony, to build something that was only mine. It turns out that's all I ever needed the space for.